Everybody. Welcome to this episode of Local History Happy Hour brought to you by the Museum of Ventura County. My name is Elena Brokaw. I am the Barbara Bernard Smith Executive Director at the museum. And in this program, I get to sit down with local authors and talk about their books, their lives, and the region. So tonight, I am going to interview local historian Jeff Maulhardt, who is here with us. Jeff is a lifelong resident of Ventura County and taught history in Oxnard schools for most of his career. After he retired, he founded the Oxnard Historic Farm Park and has written many books and obviously enjoys his local ale also. So his most recent book is A History of Oxnard. I'm going to talk with him for a bit, ask him a few questions, and then we will open it up for your questions, which will take at around 5:35 or so. And if you have questions, and I hope you do, please put them in the Q&A, and our Deputy Director, Denise Sindelar, will review those and then relay them to Jeff at that time. So welcome, Jeff.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So before we get started, I want to talk about the happy hour part of the Local History Happy Hour, because we always do. We always let our guests choose the cocktail of the evening. So why don't you tell us about what you chose?
I chose a beer from Poseidon Brewery, and that's a Ventura. And this is a blood orange pale ale. It's only 5.6, but you can have more than one. But I chose that brewery because they worked with me in the past. A couple years ago, we had a reunion of the Borchard side of my family, 150 years of Ventura County in 2017, and they actually came up with a beer for the event. And so I definitely want to support them. And what they did, in addition to making this beer, they also brewed it in the style of the day, which had been in the steam brewing in the 1880s, 1890s. So anyway, really good people over there at Poseidon, and they have some really good beer.
Well, great. I also am enjoying it because I always force myself to drink whatever the guest is having. And I'm not a beer person, but it is quite delicious. I have to say, I'm quite enjoying it. All right, so let's get right into things. So I said in my intro of you that you have written many books. You have actually written 16 books, or is it only 16 published and one more that hasn't been published yet?
The 16th will come out in probably October, November.
Okay. All right, so tonight we're going to talk about your 15th book, just early on in your career, which is this one. A History of Oxnard. And by the way, everything we talk about tonight, you can get at the Historic Farm Park, and Jeff will be talking about that later. So before that, you've written a lot of other ones. I have some of them back here. I've got Oxnard Sugar Beets. I've got Beans, Beets, and Babies. I also have Baseball in Ventura County. You've written about a huge number of topics, but let's talk about this book. So why don't you tell us in a couple of sentences what this book is about and how it's different from your other books and other histories of Oxnard.
Well, there's definitely a connection between the other books because it is local history, but it's a different publisher. 11 of my books have been with Arcadia Publishing. My first 4 were self-published, but the self-publishing led to my connection with Arcadia. And then from there, this company called HBN Books contacted me out of Texas, and they want to know if I want to write a history of Oxnard. I said, well, I've been writing it and I'd love to do it. And they made a deal with us where they would come up with sponsors for the second half of the book, which would tell even a bigger story than what I'm writing, which I really like that part. And from there, they'd give us 400 books. We sell them at $49.95, but if you come to the farm park, I'll take $10 off. And so all of the money, 100% of the money goes back to the farm park as a fundraiser. And another reason I really like this book is it gave me a chance to put more words on the page. I actually turned in 55,000 words, and they got back to me stating that they didn't have enough sponsors to cover that amount. So they told me to knock off 25,000 words. And I said, I can't do that. So I found a couple more sponsors, and we got it up to almost 40,000 words. And that tells a bigger story, but there's always more to be written, and that's for sure.
So in other words, even though this book is 135 pages long, there's a lot more to the history of Oxnard than you were able to put in here.
Yep, I still have them on my computer, and there's always more to add, that's for sure. And I learn something every time I do these books, you know. So I enjoy it, and one thing leads to another, and I'm hoping that we can come across some more pictures that are hidden out there that people have in their archives that want to share with the museum and with my farm park, and we can do some more publications.
Yeah, the book is filled with pictures for those of you who haven't seen it. Okay, so you start off the book sort of with an overarching statement about the history of California, and it's this: California's history can be divided into 4 phases: Native American, Spanish, Mexican, and American. Each period overlaps and affects the other in profound ways. So what is your favorite phase of California history to explore?
Well, it's hard to say one, because I think they're all of importance and they're all of interest. I kind of like that California stage, you know, when you have that transition period when Mexico got its independence from Spain in 1821, and you saw, you know, the early Californios starting to establish their lifestyles, and you know, it stayed pretty much the same in the cattle industry for 25 years or so. But there's a lot of those families still around, and it's fun to see those people out there and hear their connections. And then from there, of course, it goes into the American period, and that's when my family came in 1867. And those early years are the most interesting to me because they all had a sacrifice to get here. I mean, my great-grandfather, Jacob Maulhardt, had to work as a butcher on the ship to come from Germany to New York. And then from there, they took a boat to the Panama, and they still had the isthmus, so they had to walk 40 miles across, catch a boat on the other side, and then come to Northern California before they worked their way down to what became Southern California, Ventura County.
Yeah, well, I want to talk about your family in a little bit, but first I want to go into Oxnard a little bit more. So, okay, in a minute, I'm going to ask you about what is arguably like the factor that made Oxnard what it is today. But before I do that, what do you think, can you summarize what makes Oxnard the unique town that it is?
Well, I think it's unique because it has contributions from people from all parts of the world. I mean, you know, I mentioned my family from Germany. You had the Irish that came over, and they all worked together. You had the Californios that were here, and their early families like the Camarillo and Covarrubias family. They all met over at the Mission Church, and then eventually established their own houses of worship over here on the plain. And then you had other groups. You know, the Portuguese came over here, and they were very instrumental in helping develop the lima bean industry. You know, they worked together. I have these panoramics, one from my great grandfather about 1910, another one from the Leonard Ranch around the same time, and it shows the same guys. They knew what they were doing. One guy was really good at sewing up the sacks. One guy was really good at raking up the hay, or one was really good at working on the machines itself. So there are a lot of different groups of people that have made their contributions to the area, and because of that, I think you have a lot to draw from, and it's made it a more diverse and I think prosperous place.
So I'm going to ask you a sort of a tough thing, because I want to talk about the Oxnard brothers and the sugar beet factory, because I find it to be such an amazing, interesting story. So can you really quickly kind of summarize the 50 years before the sugar beet factory was built? So like what was happening in Oxnard, basically from California statehood up until from 1850 up until the end of up until the beginning of the 20th century?
So if you're talking about Oxnard itself, that was part of the El Rio de Santa Clara Ola Colonia Rancho, and that was about 44,000 acres. It was granted to 8 soldiers from Santa Barbara, although only a couple of families came over here, because in most cases, they might have gotten grants for 1 or 2 places and try to figure out what was the best place to make a living. The disadvantage of the Colonia Rancho is that it was on the other side of the Santa Clara River, and the main action was over there, Ventura, and then up north to Santa Barbara. So there wasn't a lot of population here during the 1840s and 50s. And then by the 1860s, when the Americans started looking for more places to farm or raise cattle or sheep, there was a lot of sheep in the area. Then you saw a change at that time. And then the farming that they did was more dry farming. So you can get away with a smaller population with dry farming. The first crop on the plain was barley. That's why we had the barley beer made for the 150 years of Ventura County. And with barley, you can
tell those of us who don't know what dry farming is.
Dry farming is you don't need a designated irrigation system. So you can use, you're using Mother Nature to give you the moisture that you need. And so lima beans was a perfect example. That was introduced in the late 1880s in Ventura County. And I remember, like, right now we have this May gray, and it's funny because some people never heard of May gray. When I was growing up, we always heard it was lima bean weather. And the reason is the moisture from, the coastline would help, irrigate the lima beans. And I know I've told you the story before, but I'll tell everybody else, is I planted some lima beans here in my property here in Camarillo. I have like an acre and a half. So I planted a bunch of lima beans back in 2001. And I went to Emil Filer, who's the old farming family guy, and he had some old lima beans, and I planted those in my yard. And so I was all proud and everything. And I called him up and I said, Mr. Filer, how often should I water these lima beans? He said, 2 or 3 times. I said, a week? He goes, no, for the summer. Well, that's an example of dry farming. So, but the farmers are always looking for something else to make money, because if everybody's growing lima beans, less people make money. So even though you didn't need a big crew to plant them, you didn't need you needed a crew to harvest them, but for maybe about, a week or so, the population could stay low for the first 30 years or so. You could use the older boys to help out. You could use the family members to help out. And I even have that one slide there of when Jacob Maulhardt and Godfrey Maulhardt were working for John Edward Borchard. And on that slide there, it shows that they were getting paid to cut barley. The next one after that, I think, $1.50 an acre to cut barley by hand. And so, you got to work a lot of acreage to get paid a decent amount of money, but that's what they did. They worked for each other, and they didn't need a big workforce for those first 30 years or so. It wasn't until the sugar beet was introduced, and then you had a whole new group of workers that needed to be introduced and help develop that industry.
Whoops, sorry, I lost you. I'm playing with the slideshow now. I got distracted. Oops, sorry. Okay, so, all right, so we've got lima beans. Lima beans is the predominant crop. And so tell us about where the sugar beet came from. How did that end up being such a major crop in Oxnard?
Well, it was interesting because right before the lima bean was, actually right before the sugar beet was introduced, the farmers were growing potatoes. So in the 1890s, they actually had a starch factory in Hueneme. And it was moderately successful, and it was kind of a lot of hard work, especially harvesting. So they kept their eye open for other crops. And John Edward Borchard lived off Gonzales Road. He had a son, Henry, who was going to St. Vincent's College in LA, along with Albert Maulhardt. This is in the early 1890s. And those boys heard about the sugar factory in Chino. So John Edward was growing this strain of sugar beets for his livestock, to feed his livestock. And it was a German strain of sugar beet. So anyways, he had the idea of harvesting those and getting them over to Chino to see if he can make some money off those. And they weren't the right variety, but they were introduced to the sugar factory over there in Chino. And they were given some sugar beets to bring back to the county to see how they might do. At this point, this young man in his early 20s named Albert Maulhardt got those sugar beets, and he contacted 200 different farmers in the area. Actually, it was about 200 different farmers in the area, and he planted from 1/2 acre to 50 to 5 acres of sugar beets in 1896. They took the results back to Chino, and the sugar content was like 32%. And in Chino, they were getting between 18 and 20% sugar content on the sugar beet. So they knew that, this was a good area to grow the sugar beet. So the Oxnard brothers, who owned the Chino factory, asked Albert to do one more year of sugar experiments. And if they did well a second year, they would commit to building this $2 million factory. And they said they promised to build the largest sugar processing plant in the whole United States, actually in the whole world. And so after a second successive year, they went ahead and able to prove to the Oxnards that this was a place to build a factory. And they did. They started constructing it in December of 1897. And by the end of 1898, it was operational.
So, one of the things that I've always heard, and I think that you mentioned this in your book too, is that there was national legislation that really supported the development of local sugar sourcing. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, things have to align up in order to go ahead and make things happen in agriculture or anything. And so Henry Oxnard, his family actually lived in Louisiana in the 1850s, and they grew cane sugar there. But with the Civil War coming up, they decided to go ahead and go back to the East Coast where they lived before, in the Boston area, and continue doing the processing of sugar. But Henry decided to go to Europe and see what they did in France and in Germany, and found out that they were growing sugar beets in areas that weren't quite as tropical. And so he knew that he could bring that idea and those crops back here to United States, but they would need help from the government. And the help that they got was to have a lessening of taxes on any imported machinery coming from Europe to the United States, and then also to get some tariffs out there to allow the farmers to guarantee their profit. And so that's what he did. I mean, Henry Oxnard was a lobbyist in Washington, D.C., basically, to get legislation in the favor of the beet industry that started in 1891 when he built 3 factories, 2 in Nebraska, 1 in California. And then things changed about 1894. That tariff was dropped. So he went for another tariff, the Dingley tariff, in 1897. With that coming through, he knew that he could reinvest in the industry, and Oxnard benefited from that when it was being built in that time.
Okay, so you said the sugar beet factory that they built, and they completed it in 1898, which, by the way, seems ridiculously fast, given how big it was and everything, was $2 million in it at that then. And what do you know what that is today? I think you do.
Yeah, what I do all the time when I look at these numbers from the past is I'll go on the internet and I'll find an inflation calculator and find out how much that money would transfer to. And at one point when I did the book back in the 2000 or so, one of my books, I think it was $34 million. At $2 million translated to $34 million into today's money. Now it might be closer to $50 million in today's money. And so the Oxnards invested that money that they had, and they had some investors back in New York that helped them. And when you look at the number that was invested, their money was actually a little bit less than some of the other people. So it's kind of ironic that
and
they
also
definitely got the credit.
And also they had what I think of as developer agreements, right? I mean, there was a lot that they needed to have conceded to them. I don't remember all of it, but it's not like they came in, bought the land, and then built the factory. There was a lot of things that the region had to come up with.
Well, yeah, they had to get a guarantee from the farmers that they would grow the sugar beets, and they would get people to come and give lectures on how to grow the sugar beets. And they had to get some workforces. They had to know that they can get, like, contracted labor to come in. And that's when a lot of the Japanese came in, some of the Chinese, and also the Mexicans came to work in the fields at that time, and the population boomed there for a short amount of time, and is because they needed that contracted labor, and they needed the farmers to guarantee that they would grow at least, I think, 10,000 acres the first year. It might have been up to 20,000 at one point. By doing that, they knew that their factory was worth the money that they're investing in, and they'll get their money back eventually, and the farmers would be guaranteed. Usually it was like 2 cents, I think, a pound is what they got back, which doesn't sound like a lot today, but you guys can do your inflation calculator and find out it's probably worth a quarter now.
So I don't remember if you say this, like, do you know what percentage of the crops were sugar beets from like at around 1900?
1900 sugar beets, it still wasn't the major crop. I don't think it ever became the #1 crop in Ventura County because lima beans were still being grown at the same time, and they were easier to grow and they weren't as expensive to invest in. So I remember talking to an old farmer years ago, and he told me how his family never grew sugar beets. I go, why not? He goes, it's too expensive. He said, you had to have money to invest in it. And if you didn't get your money back on it, you lost your farm. So you had to have, and the other thing about sugar beets too, is that you can never grow successive crops in the same acreage. So if you had 100 acres, you would do 50 in sugar beets and 50 in lima beans, and then switch over those 50s. So that way that the ground would replenish itself, because the sugar beets took out all the nitrogen in the soil.
Right. Okay, so sugar beet factory. We can move off of that, because that what is really interesting is what that did to Oxnard. So it opened in 1898. So tell us in a nutshell about the next sort of 5 years. What happened in Oxnard after it opened?
Well, they had to come up with a town site. So James A. Driffel was the superintendent of the sugar factory, and he was in charge of laying out the town site. And so they actually purchased some land from the Hill family, and it was right next to the Hill Ranch, of course. And from there, they started enticing people to come and bring their businesses. And so places like Wainimi, Montalvo, and so forth actually came to the area, and they would move their whole buildings. Because remember, there weren't streets, there weren't trees in most cases, so you just had to go ahead and use a team of mules and a bunch of logs and pulleys and try to get that building sledded over to this new town site. And so there was a couple of barns, one from the Hill family that was in Montalvo, that they brought in and made into a hotel. And that was there for 40 years before they finally tore that down. But so yeah, during this time, you had a lot of people come to the area with high hopes, and Oxnard started to get its reputation as the biggest little town on the coast. And so a lot more people just knew that there is opportunity here in the area.
So it became a boom town, basically, after the sugar beet factory, right? But that was the precipitating factor, right? That's what I got from your book.
Right. And I know, the people wanted to incorporate, but they wanted to incorporate in a way that included enough tax base to make it worth their while. And in 1902, I know they had this vote, and I forgot what it was. I think you have it written down someplace, where it was totally voted down.
It was 261 to 11 against incorporating.
Yeah. So we place, but it was a landslide not to incorporate, even though the people wanted to have a city incorporation. And the reason is because the sugar factory wasn't included. They knew they needed that to have a tax base to go ahead and create the town that they wanted to create. And they also wanted to include some of the surrounding farmland, the hill farmland. My family had some farmland to the north that they actually got to, and the Borchards had some farmland over there. They wanted to include some of that area as city land, so that way they knew they can expand out, even though they didn't take it, they're out.
You're still there, but it's just your name. Your camera turned off for some reason.
whoever's calling me, I'm declining.
Okay. Oh, okay. Somebody's calling. How dare they call you during
yeah, they can go through the
happy hour?
Yeah, they can go through the protocol and they can type in their question. They don't need to call.
Okay, so there was a development, a really interesting development, I think, soon after the completion of the sugar beet factory. I think it was 1902. And you had talked about how many laborers came, right? And immigrant laborers. So there was a lot of Japanese, there were a lot of Chinese, a lot of Mexican, and there was the creation of the Japanese Mexican Labor Union. Isn't that what it is? Labor Association in 1903. Is that right?
Whatever I wrote in the book, that's right. And
yeah.
I got from Dr. Frank Barajas, who's done a lot of research on it, and I'm sure he'll talk a lot about it in his session there. But one thing I do want to point out about that, at that time, it seemed to be 2/3 Japanese, 1/3 Mexican. So the Japanese population, they were single men from Japan. They were contracted not just to work here, but also to work in other surrounding cities and surrounding areas. And they didn't stay here for very long. And some of those families did, of course, eventually, but the majority of those contracted workers were just here for the labor period, and then they left the area. So it didn't add to the population so much in that way, although it did influence the population because many of those people found that this was a place that they wanted to go ahead and keep working.
Yeah. I mean, that story's interesting to me, and we will talk. We're interviewing Dr. Frank Barajas from Cal State Channel Islands in July. I think it's July 14th off the top of my head. But it's interesting to me because they successfully struck. They had a successful strike, right, for better working conditions. Mm-hmm. And you know, the history of California, there are a lot of unsuccessful strikes. So it's a very impressive story, I think. Another interesting thing to me, so the sugar beet factory closed, I think we already talked about this, in 1958. And you and I talked about this a little bit earlier. There's so many towns in the United States that are like company towns where the industry, the town builds up around the company. And then when the factory shutters, and I was literally thinking about the Studebaker factory in South Bend, Indiana. And when it closed, it nearly, the town nearly went away. But that didn't happen here. And can you opine a little bit on why that didn't happen, or tell us why it didn't happen?
Yeah, I can give you my opinion on it. And I think the main reason is because we still had other agriculture to go ahead and depend upon. And, I think the farmers kind of saw the end during the Second World War. There was a last bit of a peak period, but farmers were always looking for some way to expand their horizon, and in this case, agriculture horizon. So they were always looking for something else. I mean, row crops came in after the World War II, and after World War II, you had another group of people coming in. A lot of the Japanese that are here today, the Hiji family and Ishimori and other families, came here and introduced a lot of different crops that we grow today that are our number 1, 2, 3 crops in the area. And so there was a transition period where people knew that they could actually try something else. And they even had a lot of citrus in the area, and then they had walnuts, believe it or not. I mean, I'm pretty sure, I double check it, but when Cesar Chavez came, when his dad came here, like about 1938 or 39, he was actually coming through for a short amount of time to work in the walnut orchards that were around here. And so, we'll see something else. I know that I was talking to some people that were on a committee in Oxnard about the Strawberry Festival and how important that is and so forth. And I brought up, and I hate to be a Debbie Downer on that, and I hate to quote my wife, but anyways, it may not be the number 1 crop in the future. It's going to change. And so, I mean, you can always still acknowledge it, but crops change because people are looking for a way to make that next buck, and you can't blame them. It's a business. So.
Oh, definitely. I mean, and it's always so interesting to me. I grew up in a farming family, and my father was, my father was the best person alive. But I was always really struck by how creative he was and ingenious. And I thought he was unusual. He was unusual in a lot of ways. But in learning more about the history of agriculture in our county, it is a history of creativity and wit, right?
You have to think outside the box, you have to think outside, the lines. You have to think outside the rows of agriculture and be ready for that next, and you have to stick your neck out sometimes. I mean, people don't like to do that, but it's either like lose it or, make the effort to try to make some more in another way.
Think outside the rows. That is a very good, Oxnard Plains version of think outside the box. Okay, I want to remind people that you can put your questions into Q&A, or you can put them in a chat wherever. Denise and I will keep an eye out for them. And I have a few more questions about other things, but Jeff, before we turn to everybody else's questions, I want to talk about your family, because you have a very recognizable name, Maulhardt. You were on the cover of, or the Maulhardt clan was on the cover of the Ventura County Reporter, I think last week, which was great. So I know you love talking about your family roots. Just tell us some stories about your family.
Well, I like the fact that they came from a peasant background. When I went to Germany back in 1997 to do research on my family, the Maulhardt family. I'm also related to the Borchard family. They're from the same area. But also there's like the Diedrich family and the Friedrich and the Scholey and the Wuckerfenny, Ryman family. They're all from these central villages in Germany, still farming to this day. And I went there and I saw all this history, and I couldn't believe that they still had something to show for it, because it wasn't in the industrial areas. But I thought, my family must have had money when they came here and stuff, but I found out they didn't, and that's when I found out that Jacob worked as a butcher to come over here. My other great-great-grandfather, Johannes, came over with his two sons, and one of them died on the way. He was 6 years old. He died, was buried in New York. The other one died of dysentery, was buried in Santa Barbara. And so he lost his two boys, on his sacrifice to come over here to this new land to try to start a new life. And so anyways, they had the humble beginnings. And I always like that part when I found that out, because they're also very generous. I know, like John Borchard, he gave the 10 acres and $20,000 to build the first St. John's Hospital. When I was first doing my history stuff with the museum, someone said, why should we have a museum that just glorifies a rich farmer who never gave back? I give that example of why we need it, because, he was, he ended up with some money for sure, but he didn't have it for a lot of years, and he gave a lot back. And so I'm proud of the efforts that they've all made. And, the thing about that article is that, it was sad in some ways, because it's an end of an era where my family was farming that same land for 150 years, the land that they bought from Juan Camarillo for $10 an acre, but they leased it for 5 years before they could even try to buy it at that time. And so later generations prospered, but like a lot of families, you get 4 or 5 siblings and you split up a piece of land. Now that land becomes a smaller amount. Some of it can't be farmed anymore. Eventually, by 5th generation, you're lucky to have an acre and a half in Camarillo and a farm park in Oxnard. So
I see a couple of questions. I'm actually going to ask Denise, because we're at that magic 5:35 time, to share with us some of the questions that people have out there. So Denise, let's give it to you.
All right. So Jeff, Alberta Word wants to know, technically, how long does it take for a sugar beet to mature from planting to harvest? Do you know?
Well, basically it's planted in the spring, and we actually plant some at the Oxnard Historic Farm Park every year. We planted some recently, a little bit late this time, but planted in the spring. And then by early fall is when we go ahead and we harvest them. If you keep them in too long, then they become too tough, but we do grow it, and we've learned a lot from it. When they say that you can't grow successful crops in the same area, that's been proven at the farm park. The next year, whatever we try to plant in that same plot doesn't grow. So we have to try to find a crop that puts nitrogen back in the soil. And so it's a spring, summer growing season for a sugar beet.
Can I just ask a follow-up question? Can you eat a sugar beet like you eat a regular beet?
I never have, but we looked into it, as members at the farm park. I have the master gardeners out there. And what we've read, and we plan to do it this year, is that you can actually cut it up and you can bake it or boil it. It's kind of like, a sweet potato.
Oh, you should. I think everybody on this local history happy hour would love to try some sugar beet at home.
Okay, well, what happens? See first.
Sugar beet bake-off.
Yeah, hey, good idea.
Okay, so Jeff, Gary Blum wants you to talk a little bit about all the great programming that you do at the farm park, that you founded, you manage it, and give us a little PSA. Talk about what you've done in the past and what's upcoming.
Okay, well, thanks, Gary. And it's about half of what they do at the Heritage Square where Gary's at. They do a lot of great things over there. But we have tried to do a monthly food truck out there right now, where last time we had a Filipino fusion truck, and then we had some music. And then I have my master gardeners come out there and they can tour the site. I had Chuck Covarrubias bring 4 other restored tractors, in addition to the 9 tractors that we have out there. We have 2 large original lima bean threshers, and those are on display. And then we also have our vineyards. We have 2 small vineyards of 30 vines each that are growing as Zinfandel, and the cuttings come from Santa Cruz Island. And those cuttings were first planted back in the 1880s. So we have a historic vine there at the farm park. And one of our next big events is actually the 19th of June. It's Saturday. We're going to do a baseball thing. So I've written 2 baseball books, and a guy named Ralph Morello, who played for the Dodgers briefly and knows Tommy Lasorda, is going to come out. He's written a book. He's going to sing the national anthem at the farm park. And we're going to have some music and some hot dogs, and get people out there to maybe buy their dad a Father's Day gift at the farm park on the 19th of June. And we'll have everything on our website too, which is the oxnardfarmpark.org. But our goal is to expand our educational portion of the farm park, and try to get some QR codes out there so we can place those around there, and they'll tell the story of each of the machines and the different things that we have out there. Like we did grow lima beans again. So if you go out there on the 19th, you can see a plot of lima beans. You'll see the sugar beets growing, and we have other things too. We have lemons and avocados that were donated from Brokaw Nursery several years ago, and we have those growing for us. So a lot of good stuff at the farm park. And also it's a place where you can buy these local history books, and 100% of the money comes back to the farm park. We're a nonprofit. I don't get paid a penny. My wife thinks I'm crazy, but it's important to me, and I want to keep this thing going.
Great. A couple more questions. So William Salsway wants to know, he says sugar beets require a lot of water, he thought. So how were sugar beets irrigated, since Ventura County was best known for dry farming?
That's when they introduced well drilling. Albert Maulhardt, who also introduced the sugar beets, formed a company to dig wells at the different ranches throughout the area. Now they did have a ditch that ran, through Rose Avenue, which used to be called Ditch Road, from the Santa Clara River, and so the farmers could access, water through there. But yeah, there's a lot more drilling, and he's right. It did need a lot of water, and that's why it probably took a lot longer. Is because to develop as an industry, because it was dry farming all those years.
Okay. I kind of messed up on my sharing of the screen. I was trying to share the picture of Albert. I think I finally did.
You know what's neat? Of Albert, that was from the Ventura paper, 1897, when they announced that they're going to build this $2 million factory. The guy was like in his 20s, and he was doing all this stuff. He's another one of those guys, kind of like your dad, who was thinking outside the box and doing all the different things to make it work. I mean, they not only had to get the farmers to commit to grow in that, they had to find a way to get the train across Ventura to Oxnard. So they had to go to the county supervisors, and local farmers like Thomas Rice, John Edward Borchard, and a few others actually gave their own personal money to help build the bridge across the Santa Clara. So that way the Oxnards would have their contract with the sugar factory people.
So John Carroll wants to know if he missed why the factory closed, the sugar beet factory, and also wants to share that being from Dana Point, they love and appreciate all of the great agriculture here in Ventura County and what keeps the farmers so dedicated to farming and not selling out to developers.
Well, it's a loaded question, but I'll start with the first part. And the reason it closed is fewer and fewer people were growing sugar beets. So like I mentioned before, it was a hard crop to grow because you couldn't do it successfully in the same areas. It was expensive to grow. You could make money on good years, of course. So people became less interested too. By 1958, only 30% of the factory was being used. So the company in charge at that time had to decide, do we reinvest in upgrading the factory, or do we go ahead and just close out and concentrate in different areas? And that's what they did. They decided to close up, and they moved all their archives to Minnesota, where it's kind of funny because I've used their historical society for some of my images. So if you ever use my images, remember I got them from Minnesota Historical Society, and I paid $75 each for them. So you need to pay them too, or pay me.
Okay, the second half of that question was
Second half,
why are we?
Why are they not?
Yeah.
Why are they so dedicated and not being sold out? Well, some people didn't have a choice. For example, like my cousins who were just selling that last 110 acres there behind St. John's Hospital off Rose Avenue and so forth. The school district was eyeing that property, and so they had to work with them. I mean, if they didn't, there's a possibility that the school district could condemn it and get it for less. I'm not saying they threaten that or going to do that, but it is a possibility. And the other thing too is that, you know, they're surrounded by houses, so they would lease out the majority of the land to strawberry farmers, and you know, they had a hard time growing strawberries on the first 10 acres or so because they couldn't use certain chemicals, and so it's less productive. So in the case of my family and some of the other people squeezed out. Other people, I think, you know, it's like in their blood when you talk to some of these guys, although some of them are getting frustrated. I'm not going to mention any names, but I talked to one guy the other day who's thinking about closing up because of all the restrictions that he has to go through and so forth. But, you know, we do have the SOAR protected areas that even if they sell out, it will stay in farmland. And I think the more farmland we have, the better quality of life we all have. And so I'm glad that we have that and hope that we continue with it.
And SOAR, just, you know, if you're from Dana Point, maybe you don't know, it was created, I think it was voted in 1995, I think in Ventura, and then in the county right after, and it stands for Save Our Agricultural Resources. And essentially, Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, you cannot sell a parcel that was used for agriculture at that time for any other use, I think, unless it goes to a vote. Isn't that right? Yeah. So it's...
Yeah. What the cities did too, to kind of protect themselves when they knew this was coming down, they created what they call a sphere of influence perimeter around the city. So all the farmland in there, it may look like, all right, this is all protected. It wasn't protected. So some of it was under the false impression that it's going to be around forever. But, you know, some things you can't. Being a historian and have my farm park, you can't save everything. You can say some things, you know, more things will come with it. So you just have to compromise.
But, you know, Jeff, I mean, you do so much history about agriculture and about the farmers and the people behind the agriculture, not just farmers, laborers, everybody. And there is a mentality of grit and obstinance, kind of, in a lot of these people. And I come from a family of them. I'm sure those of you who know me will be shocked to hear that I come from obstinate family members. But I mean, that is, you find that in a lot of people who continue to farm the land because it's difficult stuff.
Right. And I know people that are kind of new to the area, and they interview some of these farming families and different people, they realize that, they're kind of a different breed. And I'll run into some people that, are old farming families, and we start talking, and we practically become best friends because we have so much in common. Like I see Jack McGrath sometimes over here around the corner, and we got to talk, and next thing you know, we have way more in common than we realized, because his ancestry and my ancestry were doing about the same thing along the way. And of course, you'll find out there's a couple ancestors that married into the families, and so there's always that connection there too.
Great. So I have a couple more questions. Jaime Marino wants to thank you, Tim, for your presentation, but also wants to know, with the new campus being built on the Maulhardt property, are any buildings being saved or any other artifacts from the ranch being saved?
As far as the artifacts, the family did go through and allow people to come in and take dibs on some things. And they gave me some early dibs, like on an old tractor and some of the other stuff in the barn and so forth. But from what I understand, because I'm not in on the dealings of that, but I have looked at some of the meetings that they've had online through the city, that they're going to develop that property into like 3 stages. One is the school area, about 60 acres or so, and then a second section is going to be more residential and partial commercial. The third one is going to be more affordable housing. So the third area is going to be developed last, and that's the area where the house and the barn is right now. So it just depends on how the developer wants to work with it, but it kind of comes out of the hand of the family at a certain point, and I'm not sure if anything's going to be saved. But there's definitely a lot of discussion. It's not something you can just go and just tear down. So it'll be probably a couple of years before that decision is made. The other things will be done first, and then everybody will see where they're at and go from there. But if you do save it, I mean, it's a lot of money to restore that stuff and to maintain it and so forth. But we'll see what happens. Hope for the best.
Okay. So Ruth Kilday, who serves on the museum's accessions committee, is asking, the Camarillo Taylor sisters want to know if Jeff is related to Mike and David Maulhardt, who went to Camarillo High School. Any relationship?
Yeah. Well, Mike Maulhardt, we called him the Rice Road Maulhardts, and funny because we're related to them on the Borchard side, because his great grandmother was a Wooker Finney and his great grandmother was a Borchard, and then we're more closely related on the Borchard side than the Maulhardt side, because I think when his line came over in 1883, Heinrich Maulhardt, they're already like second or third cousins. So, and I know Mike, he's been a very big supporter of the farm park, real nice guy, lives up in Davis, and they still have their ranch over there off Rice Road, where they have a couple oil wells and the old house and the barn that they're trying to restore and so forth. So we're distantly related. And then David was my dad's first cousin, and he was, of course, a little older than I was. He passed away maybe about 8 years ago or so. He became an architect and designed a couple of the buildings there off Rice Road for the Maulhardt Industrial Center.
Great, that family connection. You talked briefly about the top crops and talking about strawberries. And this year, hemp has come in as one of the top 10 crops in production. What are your thoughts about kind of the hemp production that's come to Ventura County and those long-term impacts it'll have on our agricultural scene?
I just think you have to keep an eye on it year to year and see, what are the consequences of it? But I think it's got to be given a chance. And I think that if they do it in a way that's not offending people, the smell's not becoming too strong in certain neighborhoods and so forth, then it's an industry that's it's going to be grown someplace anyway. And if we can do it in this county where it makes people some money and a livelihood, then I think it's worth looking into for sure.
Okay.
Hey, Denise, I found another question. It was in the chat section from Mr. Salzwedel. I'm sorry, I'm sure I butchered that last name, but how come the soil in Ventura County produces more sugar content in the sugar beets than in other locales?
Well, it was a combination of sand and clay, so they called it sandy loam. And so because of that, the roots could penetrate easily, but not too much. It still retains some of the water. So that's the main reason. It's that beautiful sandy loam that they have there on the Oxnard Plain.
Great. Well, I'm going to throw it back to you, Elena. It looks like well, I'll keep my eye open for more questions, but I'll let you continue.
Yeah. Well, I have a final question for you, Jeff, which is, as we talked about in the beginning, you were a history teacher. You have an insurance business. You started the Oxnard Historic Farm Park, and you've written 16 books. So on this session, there are a lot of people who are, really interested in local or regional history. So what advice do you have for other people, other budding historians and authors who might be on the call?
Well, I really think you have to be objective in everything that you do, every story that you hear, every picture you collect, and the more pictures you can collect, the more stories you can tell. Of course, there are stories beyond pictures, but I think it's important to collect these and try to tell the full story, both sides of the story, and not pass judgment so much, because people's perspectives change over time, as we're learning now. And there's still a reason why people are motivated to do what they do. It may not be as bad as we judge it now. And so I think it's important to keep an open mind. I've seen a lot of people who become a lot more judgmental these days, and sometimes I think it's just unfair.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting too, looking at pictures, which are basically source material, right? I mean, they are what they are. Earlier today, by the way, I was talking with the Oxnard librarian, and they have a collection of about 1,700 photos, historic photos in Oxnard, that are all available online, which you could just go to the Oxnard Public Library and find. Something I didn't know. Our museum has about 2,000 images, and we're putting on more. We're adding about 1,000 a year or more onto our online directory, and you can go in there and search Oxnard and find out about them. And I think that there are a lot of resources for people who are interested.
Yeah, and they have to realize too is that there might be a small fee for these images, but that's little to ask for what's being done. I mean, I myself have over 2,000 images archived in my personal stuff. I've been collecting for 30 years, and when people ask me for some of these images, I don't mind sharing. I ask them to give a donation someplace, in my case, the farm park. And that way, I can go forward. I have a place to collect more images. You guys can go forward. I mean, it's not easy to run a nonprofit or an institution. People need to share money too.
Hey, we just had another question pop up from James Bukowski. He said, when he was young, his family shopped for cars at the Maulhardt Beet lot. Which of your family went into the automobile business?
Yeah, that was my dad and my grandpa. My grandpa opened that. My grandfather was Robert Maulhardt, and his brother was John Maulhardt, and they opened Maulhardt International back in 1939, where they sold international trucks and tractors. And then by the late 40s, they added the Hudson dealership. And then by 1952, my grandpa added the Buick dealership. And so he had that until almost 1970. And I remember as a kid going there and was able to get, they had a candy machine and all that fun stuff there too. But they also opened up that dealership farther down the road for the International. So when they still had the property and they leased it out, I got a gas key in the early 70s when there was, not that much gas out there. So I was really popular. I could go ahead and line their cars up, and I would just go down the row and we'd barter. Okay, you're buying me dinner, you're buying me dessert, you're buying me a soda pop, which is slang for beer. And so it worked out good. But yeah, my grandfather had the Buick agency. And as a kid, I had a Skylark for a while, and then I had an International truck.
Well, I wish we had known that back then. That would have been handy to know.
Probably born yet, Elena.
Okay, another question popped up. Victor Kami wants to know, says, I know the Ventura Museum Ventura County is not accepting historic photos and documents, at least when I came and tried to donate. Are you taking those donations? So I think that's a question for you, Elena.
Yeah, so right now we have a storage issue, but we are taking scans of all of those documents. So if you want to come in, just talk to me, Elena Brokaw, and I will make sure that we can get those things scanned and then put into our collections, because that's what we're accepting nowadays, because we have digital room. Everybody has digital room. So ebrokaw@venturamuseum.org. Write me an email. Okay, so we only have 3 minutes left, and Jeff, I want to make sure that we get to talk, you get to give a plug for the Oxnard Historic Farm Park. We are huge fans of everything that you do. I personally am. Thank you so much for giving me something that I can go get my husband for Father's Day. That's perfect. On June 19th. Can you just, and I know, I mean, obviously you have so much love for it and you support it so much. So can you tell everybody the website and where they can go to donate? One last time.
Yeah, it's oxnardfarmpark.org is the website, and we have our latest information for our event. You know, we're adding more as we get more information, but it is on our website. We also have an Instagram page that I'll usually do like creative pictures. I did one of a beehive that we found in the vineyard today, so that's out there. But you know, we're open right now only Tuesdays and Saturdays from 9 to 11, but we're available other times too. I actually got 2 people coming today to rent the place, one for memorial and one for a graduation. I have 2 more memorials this summer. We have a wedding coming up. So we rent the site for events. And by coming out to our public events, people see it and they want to go ahead and rent it themselves, and try not to rent it for free, because remember, we need to get the money back for ourselves. But we'll give you a good deal. And
yes, code word local history. Okay, there you go. That's your discount phrase. Jeff, thank you so much. We could talk, I mean, I have so many other questions that I would love to ask you. I would encourage everybody to go by the farm park and pick up a copy of this or one of his other books. This is sort of a more general, overarching one, but the other ones are really specific, all very entertaining, all filled with photographs. And our next local history happy hour is going to be third Tuesday in June. It'll be June 15th with Betsy Chess, who is releasing A Daughter of the Land later this month. You'll be able to pick that up, and we'll talk to her about her memoir. And Jeff, thank you so much for this and for all that you do. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
And thank you to all of you, and good evening.